Thank you for joining us for the sixth Animal Studies Research Network virtual seminar series at UCD. This is co-organized by my collaborator, Deborah Schrijvers, and myself. In our past seminars, we have had the privilege of hearing from leading and emerging scholars in human-animal studies, exploring diverse perspectives on topics that range from non-human animals in food systems to their role in complex contexts of war. These discussions reflect the urgency of the issues we face today, encouraging dialogue and critical inquiry into how animals are represented, treated, conceptualized in contemporary society. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Liza Bauer and Iuliia Ibragimova, who will explore the role of animals in science fiction and speculative fiction, genres that already challenge and blur the categorical boundaries. I'm sure we'll get a chance to unpack some of these tensions of the genre itself later on in our discussions. So we'll hear from each of our speakers for about half an hour, followed by a 30-minute question and answer session. If you have any questions during the talk, feel free to drop them in the chat. Otherwise, save them till the end of the discussion. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the day, Dr. Liza Bauer. Her new book, Livestock and Literature, Reimagining Postanimal Companion Species, was published late last year by Palgrave Macmillan. Congratulations, Liza. She's currently the interim scientific manager of the panel on planetary thinking, a think tank at Justus Liebig University in Gießen, and is working on the question of how to answer more than human agencies in political terms, questions of more than human agencies in political terms. I will share some of her work on the chat. So without speaking more on this, Liza, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for this generous introduction. I'm really happy to be here and welcome everyone. It's great to see so many names on the list, and I'm really happy to talk about this project of mine, which has been with me for quite some time. And I also thank you for your flexibility in rescheduling this talk. I know that it was planned for earlier last year, so I'm really happy that you all made it. A brief disclaimer right in the start. You'll see lots of images in my presentation, and these were made available to me by the German artist Hartmut Kiewert. I'm quoting him in every image, and I just want to let you all know that his images are not directly connected to my work. I just found that they illustrate many of the arguments I make pretty effectively. But of course, they also have their own messages to tell, and I'm borrowing them with his permission. So, and also with the hope to make his work more well known, because I think it's very inspiring. But let's dive into my presentation. So this is a brief outline of my talk. I hope I will stick to the 30 minutes. If not, I'll have to speed it up a little in the end, but I should be fine. I'll start with a bit of background on the project, farm cyborgs in the 21st century, industrialized animal imaginaries. I'll tell you a bit about what my idea behind this entire project was. And then, as promised in the abstract, I will focus on post-animal figures in the thought experiments of science and speculative fiction, and so the important functions that they fulfill, in my opinion. And I'll focus on two of the functions they fulfill for means of time. They do many more things, but I'll give you some examples on how they work towards decentralizing human perspectives in plot and form of narratives, and on negotiating questions of who's eating whom, because this is also suggested in my title about questions of meat eating, and I suppose you're all interested in that. I close with with the designs of living and eating well among companion species, which is also one of the most central aspects of cultural work that I've encountered speculative fiction texts to do in terms of reconfiguring human-animal relations. And of course, then we'll have a discussion. So Background of the project was my PhD dissertation. The title was Livestock in the Laboratory of Literature. That was the first title. And centrally, I was asking the question, what role literary narratives can play in the urgent recalibration of our relationships to so-called livestock. And I noticed that particularly so-called livestock animals are very absent in literary animal studies so far, and are also really absent in in cultural spheres everywhere, probably everywhere in the world. And so one of the ideas was to deconstruct this idea of livestock and to come up with alternatives and to look for literature in terms of literature being a laboratory of the mind, which is an idea that Catherine Elgin has brought forth, so that on the platform of literature, we could practice new things, and we could also help our minds to come up with new ideas. So this was kind of the underlying idea of that project. And yeah, as you already mentioned, this turned into a book which was published last year. And I'm really happy to be part of this Palgrave Studies in Animals and Literature series. But the very first idea, the first moment I got the idea of writing this book was while I was reading Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake. Probably many of you are familiar with it. It's a very well-known text, and so I will not give much background on it, but just so that you know, Crake is a mad scientist, and Oryx and Crake is partly set in a dystopian future where there's lots of biotech creatures. And in this passage, Crake says, "Those are chickens." The protagonist says, "But there aren't any heads." And then a scientist says, "That's the head in the middle. There's a mouth opening at the top. They dump nutrients in there. No eyes, nor beak, nor anything. They don't need those." And chicky knobs are illustrated by Travis Smith here in the picture below, so just that you get an idea of how these creatures could look like. So these creatures are like the utilitarian dreams creature in this dystopian world, because they remove the animal ethical issues of eating meat. And they actually reminded me of chickens in the real world. This image you see here is a photograph of a living rooster, and the rooster is the result of chicken breeding that is aiming for breeding chickens in low-wage countries without feathers, so that they don't die of heat stroke so quickly. Of course, they have other health issues, and they get injured pretty easily. And in my work, I argue that these overbred and farmed animals in the 21st century, particularly now with molecular techniques, are thoroughly capitalized bodies. So they're not only commodified living beings, but they're also capitalized living beings, an idea that Richard Twine has brought forth. And there really seems to be a connection between what science and speculative fiction texts imagine and what we can actually see in the real world. And I got really fascinated in this connection between what is possible and what is impossible, and what we imagine to be possible or what we imagine to be impossible, and what is then the reality. And I had the idea that maybe there are texts out there that imagine farmed animals otherwise than in this capitalized version. So because in the end, it seems as if, so I argue in my book, so-called livestock animals are so tied up in their roles that they play in society that it's very hard. It can be very hard for many consumers to picture them as anything but livestock. And Keyword illustrates this very nicely in this image that he calls "We are leaving the earth, so there's no space for us here. So what shall we do here? What else can we do but being used or consumed by humans?" And in another central text by Laura Jean McKay, "The Animals in That Country," I'm sure many of you are familiar with it as well. There we have a very telling passage where the protagonist says that she can't look at a pig without thinking of its meat, its afterlife on her plate. And but these pigs, I mean, actually, in the novel, what happens is that there's a zoonotic disease, and it causes humans to understand what the animals are saying, or at least they think they do. It doesn't become entirely clear whether there's actually mutual understanding. But the next passage in the text is the pig addressing the human, asking her, "Is it good?" And it's this moment which is confusing for the protagonist, because she feels caught off guard because she just thought about the afterlife, the meat. So she says at first, I think she meets me, swallow, nervous. So she's playing with this idea of, does the pig want to know whether she tastes good, or does the pig ask her whether the pig tastes good in her mind? So you see, there's like lots of possibilities of what a reader could interpret into this. I read this passage out to a veterinarian, and she said intuitively that the "is it good" question of the pig would be the instinctive thing that an animal would do on encountering another. So the animal would always ask, "Are you a good person, and do you want to do any harm to me?" So this is a completely different interpretation than what I had when I thought, okay, this passage is supposed to mean that the pig is actually addressing, do I taste good? So I just wanted to show you this, that there's only these 3 words, but there's so many interpretations that you could have. But interestingly, what the protagonist does is she reassures herself, saying she keeps her eyes on her stomach, tasting her salted. So what she's doing is she's securing her role as a superior human by returning to her gustatory fantasy. So she for a brief moment is in fear of being an edible object herself, but then she quickly returns to, it's all good. I'm a human, so I'm imagining myself eating her, so I'm safe again. And this is really one of the core. This is one of the topics that you can see a lot in speculative fiction text, dealing with meat eating, and I will come back to that in a bit. But what I argue in my book is what I've hinted at before, that there seems to be this lack of imagination. So where else could livestock fit within the earth biotic community but in industrial animal agriculture? And therefore, science and speculative fiction offers imaginative platforms to try out new things. And I am by far not the first one to argue that human-animal relationships are negotiated in science and speculative fiction. You all know that. I just wanted to mention Cheryl Wind's work. Animal Authority was one of the earlier texts, and there's more that she's written on that topic. And there's also a collected volume on animals in science fiction that Nora Castle and Julia Champion have edited. And if you're interested in that topic, this book really collects like a very rich and on-the-point collection of different kinds of readings of science and speculative fiction. They don't all, I think, there's not one that is specifically focusing on livestock animals, but Nora and I wrote a chapter on a novel in there as well, which is about speaking and technology. So if you're interested in that. But to come to the post-animal figures, you already see on the image, it's another fan fiction of Margaret Atwood's novel, and the Pigoons. The Pigoons are very central characters in the novel. You see they have very human-like faces. This is not really described in the novel, but the fan fiction made it, transformed this into this human-like face. But what the Pigoons are, they are, their DNA has been edited with human DNA, so that makes their organs more adjustable to human bodies. So they are bred to grow replacement organs for humans. This was their role in this dystopian world. And you see the dystopian world depicted in the image. So the protagonist, Jimmy, is secured in his behind the fence, looking down onto the Pigoons. And the Pigoons are still capitalized beings. They are already very intelligent, as the image suggests, but they can't do him any harm because he's well protected. And these pigoons are what I argue post-animal figures. I use the term post-animal figures in two ways in my work. First of all, as a signifier describing these characters, their bodies have mostly been modified by some sort of technology. These technologies can be very obvious, as in terms of mechanical suits, but they can also be less obvious, as in terms of the DNA of the pigoons. And these characters often gain additional capabilities in the story world. So they either become very intelligent, or they become able to speak, or they can become even more effectively constrained, as the chicky-knobs that I showed you earlier, that don't even have any heads anymore. So these would also be post-animal figures. And the idea to label them like that is also not entirely mine. I also borrowed that from other scholars who have played with the idea, and I also noticed that calling these figures human, technology, animal, hybrid, or something else that is complicated like that doesn't really do justice to what they are, because they seem to become something else, and they don't seem to fit into these categories. And this leads me to the second way I use these figures. I frame them as a philosophical figure of thought as well. And these figures suggest a radical but also somewhat playful removal of the human from the center of describing species. And this playful notion is very important, because I do not want to imply with the post-animal that there's no difference between human and animals, but there's many, many differences. There's just not a categorical difference. And I think that these moments in science fiction texts, when readers are really immersed in a story and they are in a particularly perceptive state of mind, and then there might be moments where they actually forget to ask themselves whether they are imaginatively transporting themselves into the body of a human or into the body of an animal. So they're just entering this body or mind and thoughts, and they forget to ask where to draw the line. And I think that these moments are very powerful. And Melissa Bianchi has written about the post-animal condition. So she calls these speculative scenarios where distinguishing who is who and who is not human or animal has become irrelevant. And these moments are pretty powerful. And I was looking for these in literary texts. And I do think that these moments could have a lasting effect on people's imaginations. And I think that they will not necessarily stop eating meat afterwards, but they would certainly think about a pig differently the next time they perceive it. You can't really be sure about that, but I do think small shifts are happening. So this is what post-animal figures do, and they cause havoc in their story worlds and perform many functions that I describe more profoundly in my book. And one of the things they do is they decentralize human perspectives in plot and form. And I show you this with an example of the pigoons again. This text passage is from an early part of the book, so where this image fits well. So as I told you earlier, Jimmy is very well secured behind the fence. The pigoons can't do him any harm. But still, the narrative is focalized through his perspective. So he remembers that the pigoons were slightly frightening, with their runny noses and tiny, white-lashed pink eyes. They glanced up at him as if they saw him, really saw him, and might have plans for him later. "Don't fall in," said his father. "They'll eat you up in a minute." And the verbs that I have put in bold here is to show you that first we are in the conditional tense. So Jimmy remembers looking at the pigoons, and he already remembers they're somewhat menacing. So they're looking up at him, and it feels to him as if they saw him. So he's conducting a thought experiment in his mind, imagining that the pigoons could have plans for him later. So there's this possibility which frightens him, but it's only a possibility, and it's put into the conditional tense. But when his father answers him, he already says, if you fall in, they'll eat you up in a minute. So he switches here to the definite future. And this is already a switch to a more likely future, a more likely thought experiment that is being played up here. But it's still a potentiality. So this is important. In this part of the novel, we still have a very stable human perspective, playing with the possibility that the Piguns are dangerous, but still being secured within within anthropocentric rule on this planet, on this speculative version of the world. But this changes, of course, once the human infrastructure collapses in the novel. The Piguns are running loose. There's very few survivors, and Jimmy becomes like one of the last surviving humans, and he is also becoming a more delirious character. He's drinking a lot of alcohol, so sometimes you can't really trust what he's perceiving or not. And then in a climactic moment, the Piguns are hunting him. And there's this passage which really shows how, this former stable human perspective is really crumbling. So he says, "Here they come. They've nosed the door open. They are in the first room now, 20 or 30 of them, boars and sows, but the boars foremost, crowding in, grunting eagerly, snuffling at his footprints. Now one of them spots him through the bulletproof window. More grunting. Now they are all looking up at him. What they see is his head. Attached to what they know is a delicious meat pie, just waiting to be opened up." And this passage that I put in bold here shows you very nicely how the conditional or future tense has completely vanished here. So we are completely in the present tense now. What they see is his head. They are all looking up at him, and his head is attached to what they know is a delicious meat pie. So this really is a different sort of thought experiment here. Jimmy is now completely behind the shoulder of the Piguns. Or let me correct myself. It's not Jimmy now, it's the readers. So the readers, the focalization has briefly shifted to the Piguns here. Usually, for the most part of the novel, readers perceive the story through Jimmy's eyes. They are behind his shoulder. But in this moment, the readers slowly briefly move behind the shoulder of the Piguns, looking up to Jimmy. And they see Jimmy's head as a delicious meat pie. And if you remember in the passage earlier, the readers were in Jimmy's position looking down onto the Piguns. Now the readers are behind the shoulders of the Piguns looking up at Jimmy and imagining Jimmy as an edible object, as a meat pie. So this is a very, and I think this is a very powerful moment. And you see many different moments that are of similar nature throughout the text. And what I did in my work is to actually look at these narrative strategies, these narrative forms that are congruent with what's happening in the plot. So there's a dismantling of human supremacy within the story world. This is the level of narrative plot, and which correlates to a dismantling of human perspectives on the level of narrative form. And it's really fun to look into narratives and to see how they are playing with the readers in in this respect. And I hope it becomes clear. It's always a little this narratological kind of work. You can feel free to ask me questions after. I just wanted to briefly mention there's other examples that I'm dealing with in my work, but I don't have time for that here. So there's other kinds of thought experiments. I also deal with a novel by Adam Roberts, Bat, which is a very powerful thought experiment too. But since we don't have time for this, I will move to the questions of who is eating whom, because this is another central function that I wanted to talk about today. You see a different novel here, Augustina Basterica's Tender is the Flesh. The German title is Wie die Schweine, like the pigs is the translation. And I chose this illustration because I think it's a little more a little more striking than the German one. And because there's a whole range of dystopian 21st century texts, also speculative fiction, that reflect critically on meat culture realities. Meat culture I borrow from Carol Adams, you're probably familiar with. And I argue in my book that they actually emblematize the lack of imagination that I mentioned earlier. So I'm not saying that these texts are bad. They fulfill important functions. but they don't really manage to offer any alternative visions. They exacerbate violence a lot, and they conduct powerful thought experiments on how human beings can actually turn into edible objects. And this can also have very lasting, powerful impacts on their imaginations. And these are just some examples. And Tender as the Flesh, I wanted to show you one passage where in this story world, certain humans have become products and they are bred to be consumed by other humans. The reason is that animals have become, I think there was a disease that caused all livestock animals to go extinct, so there's no meat anymore. And it's a luxury to eat meat, but that is reserved only for a few. But yeah, the slaughtered beings are humans, called products. And the text says here, it's a slaughter scene. The rooms are all connected by a rail that moves the bodies from one stage to the next. Through the wide windows, they see the way the head and extremities of the female, stunned by Sergio, are cut off with a saw. A worker picks up her head and takes it to another table where he removes her eyes and puts them on a tray with a label that says eyes. He opens her mouth, cuts out the tongue, and places it on a tray with a label that says tongues. I think you get the idea of the novel. This is obviously the entire novel is really playing with vulnerability and with disgust also in the readers. It's really uncomfortable to read. And I do think that these terrifying thought experiments, they unveil how belief systems and cultural practices could one day transform certain humans into edible products as well. And even though they fall short of providing any alternatives to these brutal realities, they encourage a very uncomfortable imagining into the flesh of livestock in readers. And there might be effects of empathy for the suffering of animals after a reading experience like that. And but what I think is more important about these texts is that they actually exemplify the discursive processes that real-world cultural rituals unleash while serving to mark the divide between inedible human subjects and the edible animal others. And because this is, I think, one of the roots of the detrimental imbalance where human-animal relations are stuck. And these texts really mimic that. The hidden belief system of meat culture you're probably familiar with, so I will not go into detail about that, but there's many cultural mechanisms like speciesism, carnism, the meat paradox, advertising strategies, and a whole apparatus that secures that meat culture stays the norm, and that livestock animals are labeled as killable beings, so as categorically killable beings. And in animal studies, we also understand eating meat as a cultural performance that is very crucial because it secures beliefs in a fundamental distinction between humans and all other animals, the so-called anthropological difference. And Cora Diamond's essay Eating Meat and Eating People negotiates that topic a lot. And what you can see is that many canonical texts, they actually feature scenes where animals are being roasted and eaten, and these often correlate with markers of civilized humanity. Like in Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, for example, Robinson kills a goat and eats it then. And in speculative fiction novels, you often have counterexamples to this. Timothy Findley's Not Wanted on the Voyage, for example, features lots of humans being threatened to be cooked and eaten. And also in Margaret Atwood's The Year of the Flood, you have a scene in the end of the book where there's not an animal that's being roasted, but a biotech creature. And the human protagonists watching the scene of other humans roasting that biotech creature actually feel pity for the creature. And there you see that instead of using this as a marker of the performance of the anthropological difference, we actually have a detachment from anthropocentric hierarchies in Margaret Atwood's novel. I'm also happy to talk about this later if you're more interested in this. I just wanted to stress that particularly in Margaret Atwood's work, and I think that many speculative fiction texts that negotiate meat culture, they actually negotiate ideas of Jacques Derrida's eating well. In case you're not familiar with the concept, this idea derives from his critique against vegetarianism, his critique that vegetarianism prescribes people what to eat and not, but does not really break with the core of the problem. The core of the problem being that the human of Western philosophy is defined along the model of a flesh-eating, masculine, language-using subject, which he calls carno-phallogocentrism. This maybe goes a little bit too deep into this because we don't have time, but it's an interesting issue. And sorry, I'm a bit distracted because there's a demo going on in front of my window. This is why there was a bit of noise, so I apologize for that. But I think sorry, are you hearing that noise? No? Okay, then I will just continue. And I don't live in the city center, but there's like a demonstration, and we have elections coming up on Sunday, and it's a pretty heated political situation in Germany right now, so this is probably why. But what makes it a bit clearer what I mean by this idea of Derrida's eating well and the expanding of it is the end of my talk. Designs of living and eating well among companion species, because in the end of Margaret Atwood's trilogy, we have a moment where the three groups of characters, so the Pigoons I mentioned earlier, the gods' gardeners, which are eco-feminist humans, and mad Adamites are also humans, but they are a group of scientists. And the Quakers that you also see in the text are a post-human race that the mad scientist has created. So we have, so the Quakers are post-animals, the Pigoons are post-animals, and then we have two groups of humans, and they actually form a multi-species society in the end of the book. And this chapter opens with, the next morning they hold a trial. They sit around the dining table, or the mad Adamites and the gods' gardeners sit. The Pigoons sprawl on the grass and pebbles, the Quakers graze nearby, chewing the eternal mouthfuls of leaf, taking it all in. And so this moment is setting the scene for a negotiation between these parties about what they want to do with their enemies. So they're actually negotiating a sense of multi-species justice here. And I read Atwood's narrative as an imaginative design of a Derridian eating well among Haraway and companion species. And I argue that it contributes to the idea of, to the project of vegan studies, because it calls the readers to question what to eat and what or whom to eat and not, and whom they mark inedible or killable in the process. So the novel goes a little further than prescribing what to eat or not, but actually suggests that multiple different species with their species-specific capabilities come together at one table and negotiate whom to eat and not. It's a little tricky to do this in a short time, but it's a central element of the novel is that the Pigoons and the humans, they have a pact that they will stop eating one another. So first they say it's off limits, we will not eat one another. And this is the moment where they can actually enter into a relationship. And later on, when the society emerges, they're actually setting up new rules. So in general, they're not eating one another. But if one dies prematurely and they need the meat to nourish other sick Pigoons, for example, then they would use the meat but just under certain circumstances. And in the novel, now I quote from my book, the message Atwood seems to transport is that once the question of who is eating whom is no longer relevant, humans and post-animals become capable of forming companion species relationships. And in the emerging collective, humans, Quakers, and Pigoons are eating with or next one another and approximate a lateral instead of a hierarchical ordering. And this is really what I think where speculative fiction text can be very powerful, because they actually do not prescribe like one absolute message or one absolute truth, but they actually focus really on negotiating terms. And in the case of Edward's novel, the terms are about eating and living well among companions. And there's not a message of a prescriptive vegan ethics, and there's also not a message of a deconstructionist eating well project, but it's something in between. And I think it seems to me at least a little more productive in terms of coming up with ideas of how to live with other species. But I will come to an end. I hope my time is not, I'm okay with time, because my presentation says 45 minutes, but I think this is because of the check, right? Yeah, okay, good. What I conclude in my, and which also drives my, the argument that drives my book, is that sci-fi or speculative fiction, thought experiments encourage readers to stretch their imaginations, and that this might be a crucial step towards deindustrializing their imaginations. And I frame this metaphor of deindustrializing the imagination as both an utopian ideal, but also an essential prerequisite for us to learn how to form more respectful relationships to animals. Because these narratives actually offer imaginative platforms where readers can try out what animal sanctuaries already do. And you see that very beautifully here in this picture. At animal sanctuaries, humans and animals learn how to live inefficient lives with one another. And this way of learning to be inefficient together, to get out of the capitalist paradigm, this lies behind the idea of deindustrializing our minds. And I like to close with my favorite passage from Laura G. McKay's book again, where a former dairy cow is addressing the protagonist with the words, "Could it tell my babies I'm still here?" And the protagonist perceives the strongest of the cow's messages comes from their guts. So this was again the novel where humans think they understand what animals are saying to them. And this shows really nicely how these texts can really touch you emotionally. They get under your skin, but they do not prescribe what you should or shouldn't do. They do not aspire to yield any absolute truths, but their strength lies in experimenting with potentialities and help us out of dead-end streets where our imaginations are stuck. And they will probably not put an end to industrial animal agriculture, but as I said in the beginning, they may dig into the roots of the problem and unveil the cultural mechanisms that lie behind this detrimental imbalance. And I think that this is really important and really emphasizes why speculative fiction can become a powerful tool in terms of, figuring out how to live in the future. But with this, I thank you, and I really look forward to your questions. I have a list of works cited and the images here in case you're interested. Thank you.
Thanks, Liza. Thanks a million. And what a fantastic quote to end on as well. Looking forward to speaking with you more on this during the question and answer session. But in the meantime, I will introduce our next speaker and friend of the network, Dr. Iuliia Ibragimova. Iuliia completed her PhD in Dublin City University in 2024. Where she focuses on the sentient spaceship trope in popular culture. Her work has been published in Sephora Review and Fantastica Journal. She has also contributed to the Poulomi collections Animals and Science Fiction, which was published in 2024, which Liza mentioned in the talk as well. It's a wonderful collection. She is also the recipient of several awards and accolades, as well as a skilled translator and polyglot. Again, I'll put some of her works in chat later. But for now, Iuliia, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Poulomi. I'm now going to share my screen. I hope it works. Okay, can you see the screen? Yay.
Yeah, perfect.
Lovely. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here and talk a bit about my latest attempts in research. So I started talking about it in my dissertation. I talked about the sentient spaceship, and one of the chapters was specifically dedicated to spacefaring animals and other non-human organic sentient spaceships. So today I'm going to talk about how the spacefaring animal's body, in encounter with the human body, can become a way of reconceptualizing the relations between humans and non-humans, and also how it can be viewed through the prism of the object, and how it can lead to the idea of the politics of acceptance. So, what are spacefaring animals? First of all, which is somewhat obvious, it is a non-human animal capable of traveling through space. There are two main ways how spacefaring arise in science fiction imaginaries. One of them is domestication, when some spacefaring animal somewhere in outer space are found by humans and is domesticated by humans, or it can be engineered by humans or human-like aliens. An important part about the spacefaring animals is that they provide a safe space for humans traveling through the uninhabitable environment of outer space. So in this, the contact between the human and the non-human animal is something completely unrealistic, something that we do not have in real life, but which draws our attention to some important aspects of relations between the human and non-human. For example, the mutual dependence that we share on the large scale. Spacefaring animals are also a source of breathable air and gravity, and they also possess capacity to refine human waste, which brings me closer to the idea of the object and how the object is treated in this close contact between the human and the non-human in the conditions of the spaceflight. So I'm going to talk about three different works that cover, not roughly, but exactly 3 decades. First is Farscape. It is a science fiction TV show which was released from 1999 to 2003. And it basically follows adventures of a motley crew of different human-like and non-human-like animals who are trying to go home and protect a weapon technology from 2 warring empires. The spaceship there is Moya. She is a bioengineered Leviathan, and it is engineered by a human-like species, but also it is a bit magical. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into detail with this, but if you are interested, it's a very interesting moment between a religious and secular scientific way of creating a non-human animal. The next novel I'm going to talk about, short story I'm going to talk about is Bujum by Elizabeth Bear and Sarah Monette, which was published in 2008. It is a story about Bujum called Lavinia Watley and Black Alice, who is a lower-ranking member of a pirate crew. And in the story, the pirates first they steal some cargo that they were not supposed to steal, and they face the retribution. While facing the retribution, they're all going to die, but Black Alice is saved by Lavinia Watley the Bujum, who eats Black Alice, and Black Alice becomes a part of her eventually. And they travel to outer space together. Happy endings. And the last work I'm going to talk about is Binti novella series by Nadia Korafor, which focuses on Binti, a Himba girl in the somewhat distant future. Binti travels initially in the first novella on Miri 12 spaceship. She understands that Miri 12 spaceship is a non-human animal capable of traveling through space, bioengineered from terrestrial materials. Specifically, it looks like a shrimp. Throughout the novellas, Binti develops her relations with different animals and with Miri 12 specifically. In the last novella, Binti is killed, but through her connection with Miri 12, they come to take her body, and through their thriving microbiome, her body is resurrected, and she also becomes a part of one of the Miri 12 ship, the one that revives her, brought her back from death. So what is the initial position of the non-human animal in all the stories, in all these narratives, is very much a position of objectification and subjugation. So in two of the stories, in Farscape, stories works, in Farscape and in Bujum, spacefaring animals wear different devices, basically collars that are limiting their movements. And by limiting the movement, human exercises the power over them. And in both cases, the shift between the relations between the humans and non-human animals starts with breaking the collar. The next moment that indicates objectification of the non-human animal is the fact that they are both, not both, but that they are designed or bioengineered. All of the mentioned animals, except for Bujum is domesticated, use the material of non-human animals. And in this respect, we have this ethical moment of using something that cannot, by definition, be given consent to. So this is a different level of objectification. In both Binti and Farscape, there is some tampering with the reproduction system of the non-human animal, which is another sign of exercising power and anthropocentric premise. In Bujum specifically, the limiting color does not only limit the movement, it also is damaging to the health of the non-human animal. And it is also very important that in Bujum, humans have control over what the spacefaring animal eats. Bujums are predatory, and they're technically going to eat everything, but humans decide what they can eat and what they cannot. And in all of the works, initial stage of relations is the lack of recognition of sentience. So in all these works, these spacefaring animals are very much sentient, capable of communication. However, in the starting of their relations between the human and non-human animal in the narrative, we have this idea that they cannot communicate and that they are not sentient. It is very useful to look at the development of the relations between the human and the non-human animal in these narratives through the prism of the object, or engaging the aspects of the object. Because as Julia Kristeva conceptualizes in The Powers of Horror, the object simultaneously besieges and pulverizes the subject. One can understand that it is experienced at the peak of its strength when the subject, very fruitless wary of fruitless attempts to identify with something on the outside, finds the impossible within, when it finds that the impossible constitutes every being that is none other than object. So in these narratives, humans and animals are in such close contact with each other that it is unavoidable that they encounter the object in each other's bodies and have to deal somehow with this encounter. At the same time, the object is initially a part of the subject, and recognizing it as a part of the subject is also a part of the process of recognizing the other. So, the body of the non-human animal, the space of which the human inhabits during the spaceflight, is a living flesh, and the human has to encounter it every time they wake up, open their eyes, or take a breath in. There are processes happening in the non-human animal's body, like nutrition, digestion, childbirth, that the human becomes also privy to, that constitute a part of the object. And on the other hand, we have the object produced by the human body traveling within the spacefaring animal. In this way, both the human and non-human animal are exposed to the object in each other. This exposure, of course, produces the tension and desire to limit this contact. So in a lot of narratives, and in Farscape and Bujum and Binti specifically, there are ways to reconstruct the boundary, to divide oneself, the subject, from the object in the other. And one of the ways is covering the living flesh of spacefaring animals with non-organic materials. For example, when we see the interiors of Moya in Farscape, it is all covered with something that looks like metal. And yes, we do have organic forms. And as the designers of Farscape indicated, they intended to make it look natural, but it is still metal, which divides the humans, the passengers and human-like aliens, from the exposure to the living flesh. In Binti and in Farscape, to some extent, the living quarters of the passengers, the areas that humans are supposed to visit, are very much divided from all the internal organs of the non-human animal. And in Bujum and Binti, there is a very interesting interplay in terms of race, sex, and class, and who is admitted where. For example, in Bujum, Black Alice is a very low-ranking crew member. That is why she initially inhabits the areas where she is exposed to the digestion system and to the air production systems, which works through microbes in Lavinia Watley, Winnie, the Bujum. She is also, from the name, it is clear that she is a character of color, and her ranking in and her interaction with Bujum that is so intimate and close basically hinges on the fact that she is a character of color and a low class. Potentially, it can be discussed that she is also a woman, and the interplay of femininity and the contact with the non-human animal is discussed in Farscape with one of the main characters, Eren Sun, a female peacekeeper, becoming genetically modified with the pilot's genes, which makes you closer or more able to understand the Leviathans, Moya, specifically. In Binti, an interesting contemplation is that Binti is a Himba girl, and she uses ojitse to cover her skin, which is based on a real life experiences of the Himba tribe. When she visits the plant garden, the one that produces oxygen within the body of the spacefaring animal, she compares the smell of ojitse with the earth and microbiome in the body of the spacefaring animal. And she perceives this space, the space that exposes the inner workings of the Miri 12 spacefaring animal, as something reminding her of home, while other passengers find this space too stuffy, too smelly, and generally unpleasant. So in terms of the boundary making practices are in place. However, the object cannot be contained in this close contact. So throughout the narrative, the humans are gradually more and more exposed to the inner workings of the bodies of the spacefaring animals, which shifts their relations. So in Farscape, the first exposure comes when the crew inadvertently breaks the contraceptive seal on the Moya's tempered reproduction system, and Moya's pregnancy is activated. The delivery of her modified baby, Talon, is very traumatic because Talon has weapons, and Leviathans are initially devised as peaceful animals. And that is why Talon cannot exit the body of Moya without the problems, and the whole crew has to participate in childbirth and delivery. The next step is the recognition of the agency of the animal, but it also comes through seeing how the connection between the pilot is the symbiotic species for Leviathans, and the connection was initially enforced, but the crew decides to make it right by severing it, basically being exposed again to the whole nutrition blood exchange process between the pilot and the sentient spaceship, because pilots cannot exist outside the planet or outside the ship. And the last bit is somewhat resembling a later episode in Binti, when she descends into the plant garden producing oxygen. While Moya is infected with a virus, the crew has to descend to the insides, to the digestive system, to the blood flow of the Leviathan, and they experience this place as both beautiful and terribly smelly. Through all these contacts, the knowledge of each other, the recognition of the object as something constituting a part of the other and a part of themselves, they shift their relations in Farscape, creating a more interconnected and networked principle of relations. In Lavinia Whatley, the object is even more pronounced. It is one of the few sentient spaceships that are capable of completely reworking the human wastes into useful substances. And there is specifically an episode when Lavinia Whatley sees canned brains that they stole from a ship, and she feels disgusted, she vomits, and Lavinia Whatley, the Bujum, immediately consumes the vomit. In the same scene, Black Alice asks Lavinia Whatley for water, and the ship gives the water immediately. it is the water that is produced from the human waste and purified for further human consumption. The feeding of the Bujum is another moment of the abject horror, because the food process, Lavinia Wortley eats everything that humans order to eat, which includes the sheep itself, probably other Bujums, and humans at the same time. And a lot of other members of the crew find it disgusting, while Black Alice admires Bujum in all its forms and appearances. And eventually, Black Alice becomes food for Lavinia Wortley herself, becomes a part of the non-human animal. And in Binti, a similar process of exposure and mutual exposure to the object is happening. So I have already mentioned the smelly garden with plants that actually produces breathing air. So from the object comes something that the human will consume throughout the spaceflight. Binti's corpse, abject by definition, as a corpse is, comes on board the Miri 12 ship and is resurrected through microbiome. I should probably note that this wonderful concept art is taken from the website of Brandon Soto. I was off topic, sorry. In these encounters with the object, the boundaries between the inside and the outside are questioned, erased, and blurred. The main and the most obvious one is the domestic space, which is conceptualized by Stacey Alamar as bounded spaces existing to keep the outdoors outdoors and defining the humans as that which is protected within. So draught animals belong to the outside conceptually, and marine animals on which the analyzed ships are based also belong outside, but they become the inside for the humans traveling through outer space. It is a safe space where they are protected, and the outside of the non-human body permeates the inside of the human body, as I said, through the genetic exchange, through resurrection, through consuming water produced by spacefaring animal, and breathing air produced through and purified by the spacefaring animal. The other boundary that is ultimately challenged by these narratives is the boundary between self and the other. In Bujum and Binti, human literally becomes a part of the spacefaring animal. In Bujum, through being eaten, and in Binti, through being brought back to life. And in all of this narrative, to some extent, there is a moment of recognition by the humans, as humans recognize themselves as more than human subjects. For instance, Black Alice recognizes herself now as a part of Bujum, and in Bujum, the anthropocentric hierarchy is reversed. So the animal now defines where they are going, and Black Alice becomes a passenger taken for a ride. In Binti, the relations that they form are more equal. They create a networked and negotiable relations. They, on the one hand, the Miri 12 ship stays with Binti because Binti will die if the ship is too far away. And Binti agrees to become a negotiator on part of Miri 12 ship to present them and to bring the relations between midi-12s and humans onto the new level. All these narratives bring our attention to how the boundaries between the subject and the outside world are blurred, and they do it via the image of the spacefaring animal. It also works through the recognition of the object in the self and the other. And in all of these works, the anthropocentric hierarchy is replaced with the vision of the organism as a collective in both Moya with the symbiotic species and passengers, in Bujum through becoming literally a part of a collective of species, and in Binti, who recognizes herself as a composite being a part Medius, a part Miri-12, and a human at the same time. In conclusion, I want to say that this idea of the object of the contamination can be scaled to look at politics altogether, especially now in the world where the far right is rising. It is important that this, seeing the object as a part of the self and recognizing self as the part of the other, can be helpful to see that the society is also cannot be seen as pure. It necessarily needs to be seen as contaminated, as a multiple and diverse system where different parts work together and perform different functions. Thank you for your attention. And these are my works cited.